The storm came off the Atlantic without warning, and by 2:17 a.m. it was hammering the windows of Miami General's East Wing, like it had a score to settle with the building. Nobody on the night shift looked up. In the trauma corridor, everything that deserved attention was already bleeding. Nessa Callard stood at the medication cart outside room 14, her pen scratching through the last entry on her chart, her feet somewhere past aching and approaching numb. She was 25, a licensed RN with 3 years on the night rotation, and she had exactly $412 left in her checking account until the end of the month. Which would have been fine if Penny's infusion wasn't due Thursday. Her younger sister had been diagnosed with lupus nephritis 14 months ago. The insurance covered most of it. Most. The $94,000 in nursing school loans hadn't asked about Penny before arriving. Nessa had stopped doing the math. The math made the walls close in. She capped her pen, slid the chart back into its sleeve, and started down the corridor toward the supply room. The fluorescent overhead at the far end was out again. Had been for 2 weeks. So the hallway narrowed into a long tunnel of half-light and the distant beeping of monitors. She was almost to the supply closet door when she heard it. A sound like something large and heavy using the wall to hold itself upright. She stopped. In the alcove beside the emergency exit, the one the orderlies used as a break spot because it was out of camera range, stood a man. He had the height and build of someone who didn't usually need walls for support, which made the way he was leaning against the cinder block look wrong. His suit was dark gray, expensive, soaked through from the storm, and the left side of his dress shirt was no longer white. He had pressed his palm flat against the fabric just below his ribs, but the crimson had spread well past the edges of his hand. Nessa's training hit before fear could. "Sir," she crossed the space between them in 6 steps, keeping her voice low. "Sir, you need to be in admissions. Ground floor, east entrance, I can walk you." "No," the word came out clipped, quiet, absolute. She looked at him. Up close, his face was cut from something severe, a jaw that hadn't relaxed in years, dark hair pushed back from his forehead and wet from the rain. He had a bruise already purpling along his left cheekbone, and his eyes, when they found hers, were the deep, still grey of water before a storm drops, not panicked, calculating. A man running math in his head, and none of the equations adding up in his favor. "If I go to admissions," he said, his voice a low, deliberate rasp, "I'm dead before morning." Nessa looked at his side. The blood was moving too steadily for a surface wound. "Laceration?" she asked. "Blade about 4 inches, I think. I've had worse." She believed him, and she didn't want to. She glanced down the corridor. The charge nurse's station was around the corner, 30 feet away. She could call for help. She should call for help. If she treated this man without logging him in, without a wristband, without any paperwork at all, she was violating a 6 hospital protocols and at least 2 state regulations. But she looked at his face again, at the careful, excruciating stillness of a man who would sooner bleed out standing up than ask twice. And she did what Nessa Callard always did when the math stopped making sense. She stopped doing the math. "Come with me," she said quietly. "Don't make noise." The supply closet was 6 feet by 8 feet of stainless shelving, IV bags, and the particular smell of antiseptic and latex that Nessa had stopped noticing 3 years ago. She made him sit on the overturned crate she used as a step stool, turned on the small work lamp clipped to the lowest shelf, and unzipped the black case she kept in her own bag. The hospital's supply room had been running short on suture kits for months. She'd started buying her own. $34 at the pharmacy 2 floors down, and tonight it was the only one on hand. She snapped on gloves, lifted his shirt, and looked at what someone had done to him. The laceration was clean-edged, 4.5 inches, deep enough to need closing but not deep enough to have hit anything vital, which meant he'd been very lucky, or very fast, or both. She irrigated, packed, sutured, and taped with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a supply closet, though not on someone quite like this. He didn't make a sound, not once. He sat with his jaw set and his grey eyes fixed on the middle distance while her hands worked, and the only sign that any of it registered was the slow, controlled exhale he released when she tied off the final suture. "You're going to need antibiotics," she said, pressing a clean dressing over the site. "Real ones, prescribed." "That won't be a problem." His voice was steadier now. "The sutures should hold as long as you're careful." She stepped back, stripping off her gloves. He looked down at her hands, still bloodied inside the latex. Then he looked at her face. Then he reached up and touched the laminated badge clipped to her scrub top, turning it slightly toward the light. He read the name on it, and something shifted in his expression. Just a fraction, the way a flaw appears in glass when the light hits it at the right angle. "Nessa," he said. The name sat differently in his mouth than it did anywhere else, like he was filing it somewhere he intended to keep. "That's me." She moved toward the door. "You should go before the shift supervisor does her rounds. She'll be here in about 11 minutes. He stood. The movement cost him something, but he didn't show it any more than he'd shown the sutures. He straightened his jacket, pressed 2 fingers briefly to the dressing as if confirming the seal, and then looked at her in a way that made Nessa feel like she'd been fully memorized against her will. "I don't forget what people do for me," he said. "Not ever." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just take care of yourself." He held her gaze for 1 moment longer, then he pushed the door open and walked back out into the rain-soaked Miami night, and the storm swallowed him whole. Nessa stood in the supply closet for a long moment, the bloodied gloves in her hand, the distant sound of monitors drifting in from the corridor, and the completely irrational sensation that the world had tilted 2 degrees off its axis and hadn't tilted back. She threw away the gloves, restocked what she'd used, and went back to her charts. 4 days passed. She worked 2 more night shifts, confirmed Penny's Thursday appointment, and tried very hard not to think about the man in the supply closet. She had mostly succeeded by Friday morning, when her phone lit up with 17 notifications from her student loan servicer. She sat up in her cramped studio apartment, the AC rattling in its bracket, the Miami sun already cooking the sidewalk outside, and opened the email. Account stat, paid in full, balance. She read it 4 times. She called the servicer's number. An actual person answered immediately, which had never happened in 3 years, and confirmed in a tone of faint reverence that yes, her account had been settled. No, they could not discuss the source of the payment. Was there anything else she needed today? She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. When she arrived at the hospital for her evening shift, the charge nurse, a rigid woman named Mrs. Palafox, who had made Nessa's scheduling life a slow misery since November, met her at the locker room door with the look of someone who had recently been told very quietly to stop. "I adjusted the next 3 weeks," Mrs. Palafox said, sliding a printed schedule across without making eye contact. "You have the full weekend. Your sister's Thursday slot is covered under a new supplemental plan. Billing will contact you." Nessa stared at the schedule. "I didn't apply for any supplemental." "Have a good shift, Nurse Callard." Mrs. Palafox left. Nessa looked down at the paper in her hands, and the uneasy feeling she had been tamping down for 4 days rose through her sternum like cold water filling a sealed room. She took the bus home that night. 2 stops in, she noticed the black Escalade idling at the corner. By the 3rd stop it was still there when she stepped off and the vehicle eased forward, keeping pace with her footsteps. She knew she wasn't imagining it. She made it to the hospital parking garage the following afternoon before the footsteps caught up to her. The man had a badge. He showed it too fast, a gold shield, a name she was given half a second to read. Detective Murdoch. He was blunt and heavy-built, in a suit that had been cheap even when it was new, and his eyes moved over her with the flat assessment of someone who had already decided she was a problem to be managed. "You worked the Tuesday night shift," he said. It wasn't a question. He held up a still image printed on regular paper from the hospital's external security camera, grainy but clear enough. Her in scrubs. the man in the expensive ruined suit, moving together into the side corridor. "You treated this individual off the books. I don't know what you're." Murdoch stepped forward, closing the space between her and the concrete column behind her, and Nessa felt the parking structure's cold edge at her back. "Don't," he said, his voice dropping. "That man is Renzo Farone. He controls every port operation from Miami to Savannah, and not the legal kind. He was supposed to be found in a garage on Thursday morning. My employers arranged it. Instead, he's been very active this week, and 2 of my employer's associates have had some very unfortunate accidents." He held up the photograph again. "Where is he now?" "I didn't know who he was. I saw a man bleeding and I—" "Where is he?" Murdoch's hand shot out and grabbed the front of her jacket, pulling her forward, and the garage tilted around her. "He paid your debts." "Yes, we know about that." "He trusts you. So you are going to tell me where Farone sleeps at night, or I am going to make sure the State Nursing Board receives an anonymous tip about unregistered procedures performed on unlogged patients. You'll lose your license by Tuesday." "She already told you, Murdoch." The voice came from behind him, quiet, smooth, completely without urgencies. "She doesn't know where I sleep." Murdoch went absolutely still. He turned slowly and released Nessa's jacket. Renzo Farone stood at the entrance of the parking level, and he was not the bleeding man from the supply closet. He wore a charcoal suit cut to his exact proportions, his dark hair dry and set, the bruise along his cheekbone faded to a dull amber. The wound she had sutured was invisible under his shirt. He was entirely composed, entirely present, and the stillness he carried was the kind that didn't belong to someone who was afraid of anything in the immediate vicinity. 2 men stood behind him, large, quiet hands loose at their sides. "Mr. Farone," Murdoch started, "I know exactly what you were doing," Renzo said, "and I know who's paying you. That conversation is going to happen somewhere else." He gave a small nod, barely perceptible. The 2 men behind him moved. Murdoch made one sound, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, and then he was walking, guided firmly by the elbows, toward the stairwell, and the door swung shut behind all 3 of them with a sound like something being filed away permanently. The parking garage was empty. Nessa's back was against the concrete column and her legs had gone to liquid. Renzo crossed the space between them. She had slid partway down the pillar without fully realizing it, and he crouched in front of her and looked at her with those grey eyes that didn't soften exactly, but changed, shifted. The calculation in them became something less cold. His thumb grazed the red mark on her throat where Murdoch's grip had pressed too hard. His jaw tightened at the sight of it. "I told you," he said very quietly. "I don't forget." "You paid my loans," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Yes. I told you that you didn't owe me anything. And I told you I don't forget what people do for me. Those 2 things aren't contradictions." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it. It was warm and solid, and he pulled her upright with an ease that suggested the sutured wound wasn't troubling him much. "The men who hired Murdoch have your name, your home address, your sister's clinic schedule. This city is no longer safe for you. Not tonight." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you to come with me, and I'm asking because it is in fact a question, and you do have a choice," a pause. "But I would strongly prefer if you said yes." The boat ride took 32 minutes. Nessa sat in the back of a rigid hull inflatable that moved through the black Atlantic water at a speed that discouraged conversation, watching the Miami skyline recede. When a low, dark shape appeared ahead, an island shaped like an uneven crescent, ringed with sea grape and lit from within, she understood, fully and all at once, the scale of what she had walked into. The compound was modern concrete and glass, built into the island's natural rock in a way that made it look like it had always been there. Motion sensor lights tripped on in sequence as they walked up from the dock. A man met them at the entrance, broad-shouldered and taciturn, with a diagonal scar running through his left eyebrow that looked old and deliberately ignored. He looked at Nessa with the frank, impersonal assessment of someone calculating risk. "Bram," Renzo said without breaking stride. "East Suite. Make sure she has everything. Anyone who approaches that corridor without my direct authorization answers to me personally." "Understood," Bram said. He fell into step beside Nessa and escorted her inside without commentary. Her suite was the size of her entire apartment building's first floor. She stood in the center of it and felt the walls close in anyway. The first 3 days, Bram was a constant presence, appearing at meals at the edge of the interior garden where she was permitted to walk, at the doorway when she sat in the conservatory and stared at the water and tried to think of something other than Penny, wondering why her calls were going to voicemail. She spoke to him on the 3rd day, mostly out of desperation for contact with another human being, who wasn't silent household staff. "You don't trust me," she said. He considered the statement without offense. "It's not about trust, Miss Callard. It's about what you represent." He watched the waterline beyond the glass. "Mr. Farone has operated for 11 years without a single identifiable personal attachment. No one on the outside knew anything about him that wasn't professionally relevant. Then he walks into a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, and a nurse puts 20 stitches in him, and suddenly half his security infrastructure is repositioned around one person." He glanced at her. "You're a liability." "I didn't choose to be." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "The Varela organization had us completely outmaneuvered. 3 coordinated teams. He should be dead, Miss Callard. The fact that he isn't, that he had 4 days to regroup before they even confirmed he'd survived, that's because of your $34 suture kit." He let the words land. "I don't view you as a threat, but I view you as a variable I didn't plan for. That said," he paused, "I owe you my employer's life. Nothing will happen to you here." On the 5th evening, Renzo sent for her. His study smelled like salt air and old paper, and the kind of bourbon that came in bottles without labels. He was standing at the window when she came in, looking at the black water, and for the first time since the parking garage, he looked like a man carrying something heavier than he wanted anyone to see. "When can I go back?" she asked. She didn't sit. He turned from the window. "You're unhappy here." "I'm a licensed nurse in a glass cage on a private island. My sister thinks I'm at a family emergency. My co-workers think I called in sick." She kept her voice level because it was the only version of this conversation she could manage without coming apart. "I helped you because you were a person who was hurting, and I know how to help people who are hurting. That's all it was. I didn't sign over anything else." Renzo crossed the room slowly. He stopped a foot in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact point where the controlled authority in his expression had a fracture in it, thin as a crack running through ceramic. "You used your own supplies," he said. "Supplies you paid for yourself because a hospital the size of Miami General couldn't keep its closets stocked. You treated a complete stranger in a storage room at 2 in the morning, and you didn't ask a single question about who he was or why he was bleeding." He paused. "And then you told me I didn't owe you anything. You didn't. Every person I have ever dealt with has wanted something from me. Money, protection, fear, a favor to cash in later." His eyes held hers. "You wanted nothing, not even gratitude. You just told me to take care of myself and opened the door." He let that sit. "Do you understand what that does to a man who has spent 11 years building his entire existence on the premise that everyone eventually wants something?" Nessa opened her mouth. The compound's alarm system detonated the silence like a physical event. The lights shifted, red, pulsing, filling every room in the same aggressive rhythm. Through the window she saw the motion sensors on the north perimeter trip in sequence, lights firing one after another, like dominoes falling toward the building. Renzo had already moved. A matte black firearm materialized from inside his jacket with the fluency of long habit, and he stepped in front of her without breaking stride. Bram hit the study door at a dead run, a split lip already bleeding, an assault rifle in his hands. "North gate is down. Varela put a 12-man team on the island. They came up the reef side. The cameras don't cover it." "Safe room," Renzo said. "Jammed. They hit the electronic locks remotely." Then we move. He took Nessa's arm, keeping her behind the plane of his body. Stay close, stay low, do exactly what I tell you. They moved through the compound's back passages at a pace that made her lungs burn. Gunfire cracked somewhere overhead, automatic, coordinated, and the smell of cordite began seeping under the corridor doors. She could hear men communicating in rapid professional bursts, and she understood with a particular clarity that arrives in genuine emergencies, that these were not amateur. They reached the service corridor off the kitchen before the Varela team flanked them. 3 men cut off the south exit, tactical lights sweeping the narrow hallway. Renzo pressed himself against the door frame and returned fire, Bram covering the rear, but there were too many of them and the hallway was too straight. Nessa flattened against the wall, and her mind, the part of her that had spent 3 years keeping people alive in controlled chaos, started working with the cold, clinical precision that emergencies called up from somewhere below conscious thought. The team advancing on them was wearing tactical vests, standard construction. She knew, without pausing to think about why she knew it, exactly what those vests did and didn't cover. She had spent 3 years treating what happened when coverage failed. She had once listened to a trauma surgeon explain the geometry of penetrating injuries for 45 minutes, and she had retained every word of it. She grabbed Bram's sleeve. He didn't look at her. He was tracking the corridor, but he didn't pull away. "The man on the left," she said, fast and quiet. "His vest has a lateral gap, left side between the 4th and 5th ribs." Bram's eyes moved. "You're certain?" "I've sutured that exact gap more times than I can count." A half second, then Bram acted on it, and the geometry of the hallway shifted. Renzo understood the change in Bram's movement without being told the reason. He adapted immediately, pressing the advantage, and in under 2 minutes the corridor was clear. They reached the island's western dock. The Atlantic was loud and dark and close, and the boat was there, and Bram was already on the radio calling in the mainland team. Nessa turned to check Renzo and saw the blood. He had been grazed. Right side, just below the shoulder, the jacket torn and dark, and he was trying not to show it with the same absolute control he'd shown in the supply closet. He was failing slightly. She was across the space before he could tell her to stay back, had her hands under his jacket, and pressed her palm flat against the wound. "Sit down," she said. "We need to. Sit down." He sat on the dock's mooring post, and the sound he made. A slow exhale through his teeth, the particular relief of a body that has been holding itself upright past its limit, told her more about how much it had cost him to keep moving than anything he'd said. She worked by touch and the boat's running lights, tearing strips from the lining of his jacket because it was the cleanest available fabric, applying pressure with the efficiency of someone who had stopped flinching at blood a long time ago. His hand closed around her wrist, not pulling, just resting there, and the warmth of it was oddly grounding in the wind and the dark and the salt air. "You're bleeding again," she said. "So I am." He looked down at her hands. "You saved my life again." "I applied pressure. That's a different thing." "Nessa." She looked up. "You told Bram exactly where to aim," he said quietly. "That wasn't applying pressure." She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to the dressing. Bram had moved to the far end of the dock, phone to his ear, deliberately giving them the space of 15 feet and his turned back. When Nessa glanced at him, he met her eyes briefly over his shoulder and gave her a single small nod, the kind she understood, somehow was not handed out lightly. "She's Farone's," he said, to no one in particular, and went back to his call. Renzo's hand shifted from her wrist to her hand, and he held it. She let him because the adrenaline was wearing off and her own hands had started shaking, and it steadied them. "When this is quiet," he said, and the way he said when, not if, she believed him. "I'll take you back to Miami. New address, untraceable. Penny's treatments, every one of them, covered entirely and indefinitely. No strings that lead back to me." He paused. "You can go back to your life. It won't look exactly the same, but it'll be yours." The Atlantic was loud around them. The lights of Miami were visible on the horizon, faint and warm and steady. Nessa thought about her rattling AC unit, the lone notifications that weren't coming anymore, the supply closet and a man bleeding quietly against a cinder block wall who had read her name badge like he was committing it to a record he'd never lose. She thought about Penny's Thursday infusion, already covered under a plan she hadn't applied for. She thought about the way he'd said her name in the half-dark the first time, like it was something he intended to keep. "You need to be re-sutured when we get back," she said. "The dressing is holding, but there's going to be significant bruising along the lateral margin, and you'll need a proper antibiotic course this time, not whatever your people carry in a field kit." Is that a yes? She looked up at him. In the running lights, his grey eyes were entirely unguarded for the first time since she'd known him, and it was the most honest thing she had seen all week. "It means stop moving before you tear the dressing loose," she said. "We can negotiate everything else once you're not bleeding." The sound Renzo Farone made was not the controlled exhale of a man managing pain. It was a laugh, low and real and caught slightly off guard, and it did something to the quality of the dark around them that Nessa did not have clinical language for. She pressed her palm flat against his side and held on, and the Miami lights on the horizon held steady.